Welcome to the Non-Breaking Space Show from Austin, Texas. I'm the Internet's Christopher Schmidt, and on today's show, we are joined with Erika Hall, co-founder of Mule Design and author of Just Enough Research. Her latest book, From a Book Apart, is Conversational Design, where she discusses how we can make digital systems feel less robotic and more real. Before we get started, some things I'd like you to know. The UX Design newsletter is a weekly list of articles, tutorials, and inspiration handpicked by me. Sign up at uxdesignnewsletter.com and have the best links of the week sent to your email. Thank you for telling others about Non-Breaking Space. You can follow me on Twitter at Teleject, Teleject. And now, on with the show. Thanks, Erika, for being on the show. And we're here to talk about your new book, Conversational Design. It's out from a Book Apart. And can you just tell people what you mean by conversational design? Or do you talk about this the human interaction with a robot and with audio, or is it more than that? Or
yeah, thanks for asking. It's about looking at human conversation, like the conversation we're having right now. And, we've never had a live conversation before. It's only exchanged emails and things, but now we can talk to each other and it totally works, right? Because we speak the same language, but we don't have to set up, specific protocols. Like you said, oh, can I call you Erika? But that was like a little extra. But everything else is just like, we know how to have a conversation. And without establishing a lot of explicit agreements. And that's really cool. And humans have been doing that for, 100,000, 200,000 years, something like that. Well, there's no written record, of course. So that's kind of a problem. But we know people are really good at talking. And the book Conversational Design is about using that as a model for human interaction with digital systems. And the reason I think it's so important to talk about now is now we're at a point where computers can talk to us, kind of, and machine learning has advanced just because, the availability of storage in the cloud and processing power and all of these things have allowed us to have greater applications of machine learning, which don't necessarily mean it's super intelligent. And text messaging took off. So, and in China, it's a primary way of interacting with services. And so there was kind of an immediate false analogy to doing these, interacting with systems using exactly these modes that people use is more conversational. And so in my book, I say, well, no, if it's actually harder to interact with the system by talking to it. And if you look at the deep principles of what makes a conversation between any two people who speak the same language work, then you can understand what qualities that interaction should have, which aren't necessarily talking or texting like a chatbot.
Yeah. So that's one thing, because you talk about we have the the norms of talking, and we say, hey, what's going on, whatever. And I think we talk about I guess the most common example is that we have the Amazon Alexa device, the hockey puck, that's in almost everyone's home, I guess, pretty much. And so they kind of they made it simple, so you just say, hey, Alexa, and then you can ask it for something. But then but it's always something simple, right? It's always something like you can't go very far with it, or very I think I have it play music most of the time. It's my very expensive DJ. So pretty much. Well, let me say, and also another thing is there's also Amazon Alexa, but also while I was reading your book, I thought about a personal experience I was having. I had a medical situation, and I have to talk to a bunch of medical providers and technology providers, and medical, and researching in the industry that these people are part of. It's very thin margins in which they're operating. And so I can tell that they've automated a lot of things, because the main way they talk to me is by robocalls. and I have to go through a phone tree when they call me. He's like, hey, would you like to do this and do this? And I don't think I've ever really talked to a person from them, unless there's a major problem, or
Mhm.
anything like that. And but I was listening so I was like, well, I wonder if they've actually like thought about how annoying that is. But then two, what kind of cost savings measures they've made, but also the words that they used
Mhm.
to tell me, and then tell me the options are, because you always hear like options may have changed. So you may really have to listen to
Right.
how great our words are that we chose for these options.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, and yeah, those systems are like some of the oldest like systems that tried to fake talking to a human, those phone tree systems. And they're yeah, and I'd say at least for myself, they're way worse than if I could just go online and pick a menu of options because it takes so much time. And I think that's a really important thing to think. If you're giving somebody different options of how to interact with your service, people generally want the one, especially in a really goal oriented situation like that. People want the one that takes the least amount of time. And if a system has to read you all the options, like that is much slower than being able to scan down a menu. And so it's great, for some of these systems, I think can make doing stuff online a lot more accessible for people who are maybe visually impaired. Like that part is good. But if you're comfortable reading a menu can be faster. And the idea is you should offer somebody the mode of interaction that is the easiest for them, like, and be really context aware, like you can be with people. Like if if you're talking to a person about something, they might say like, oh, do you want me to write that down for you? Do you want me to just tell you? Can I draw you a picture? A human can really respond really quickly and understand your context and say, oh, I can work with you to figure out how to get you what you need really quickly. But a system is so rigid. And I think what happens is the organizations that create these systems think about it not like from the human side, even though people are talking a lot about empathy and human-centered design, they're still designing for the device, right? Because you can't really do human-centered mobile app design. You can't do like human-centered website design. You have to do, service design, I think gets the closest to this, to saying, oh, there's a person and there's a service, a system, a company. And you have to kind of abstract that and say, what is the individual person or the group of people, which again, we're terrible at designing for historically, but people are social and operate in groups. Like, what is the group of people need to get the value out of the system? And then what is the company, the business or the organization need to get out of that group of people to stay in business? Like, what's the exchange? And then think, well, what method of interacting is best? Is it fastest and cheapest and most effective to have somebody talk on the phone? Is it fastest to have them go to an app or a website or talk to a speaker? And I think Amazon is the closest to this because they're like, I mean, they're in my local grocery store now. And still you look at Alexa and it's exactly what you say. Like you have the Echo and you can play music. I've got one in the kitchen. And so it's great for kitchen timers, most expensive kitchen timer in the world. But the whole shopping aspect is impossible. Like very few people shop unless they already have a shopping list set up and they know like how much they're getting of each object and they're just reordering because you don't know. Like you could ask Amazon to ship you something and it could be of virtually any description, right? Even if you ask for, I'd like some paper towels, you could get a pallet of the wrong kind of paper towels instead of, 3 rolls that you really want.
right. Yeah. And I think one of the great things about Amazon was that it actually provided pictures of the items that you wanted to buy. And so,
yeah.
I think they did research, like the more photos you have, the better, because people, when they buy a car, they want to kick the tires and I don't know if people actually buy cars online, but I assume they do by the number of websites and commercials I see, but they need to see as much information as possible to make the decision. And so I've actually bought one thing from Amazon. It was to buy another Amazon Echo device because it was so easy to do. So they told me they actually told me like, hey, do you want this? Say these words, and then we'll order it for you. I'm like, oh, okay. Like other than that, like I knew I was getting that one device. I knew I could afford it, and at the time, and I was like, okay. Otherwise, like, no, that's not good.
Yeah. So it's interesting, and it's interesting to me how like the Echo never prompts you, it never offers things to you, like even the way a website can. And the other thing to keep in mind is how much people love websites, because so many companies are rushing to like conversational UI, which I would distinguish from conversational design, which is like that, oh, I'm going to talk to this interface like a person. They're rushing to that without thinking, how much people like the web because it means you don't have to talk to another person. Like, conversation is great when you feel like having a conversation, when there are benefits to having the conversation. Like, this is a lot more fun for us to have this conversation than to like go back and forth over email. That'd be terrible. But if you just want to get something done, a lot of times like, oh, I want to search through, I'm trying to find shoes to match an outfit I'm wearing to a friend's wedding. Like, that happens a lot. And you don't want to like necessarily go in a shoe store. You could like say, go to Zappos and instantly browse through like 10,000 pairs of shoes in like 20 seconds and filter them really fast and never have to talk to anybody or explain or defend your choices. And that feels, that's amazing for really functional tasks like that. You don't want to talk to a person. You especially don't want to have to negotiate with a robot personality. You want your information. But there are other times when having a more conversational interaction can be helpful. But it doesn't mean it's more human. You have to think about the humans designing it for other humans. And then even just making a really efficient, delightful web page, like Google as an example I use in my book, is a really great conversational interaction because it's turn-based, right? You go to Google, you type in a couple words, it reflects something back to you, and you can very quickly alter that input or take the next step. And Google is very error tolerant, which is a really important part of being conversational that totally gets lost in these voice systems and these chatbots, where if you say something that they're not expecting, or you give them data that they're not trained to receive and respond to, it's a disaster, and it just wastes your time, and you're left feeling dumb and guessing all the answers. But you work with Google, and you can type, because it's trained itself on like trillions and trillions of queries. It can now pattern match really well and make good guesses. If you misspell a word, it can show you results for that, and it could be very helpful at making a good guess about intent, just because it's seen so many intents and it's responded to them, and it's so fast. And the goals are really well aligned. Like, you want to get to information that matches your intent, and Google makes money by matching that. And so that's really like a conversation because it's turn-based, it's error tolerant, and it's really well aligned on goals.
So I was researching, and I think you mentioned the fact that Google is responds so quickly, though. Like, sometimes people don't know they've made an error, and that is that like error, like the fact that error, like that Google's like said, oh, you misspelled the word, but I think you mean this word, and so they actually like that's like a kind of error tolerance is what you mean.
Yeah, because it's the same way in talking to another person. Like, I could misspeak or use a partial sentence or even barely say anything at all, and you could understand me and respond to me knowing what I meant. So the whole idea of like, I know what you mean. You don't have to be like machine precise, explicit in your meaning, and I can get it and keep the conversation going. Like, that's a really important part of conversation that is not captured in most of these systems that consider themselves conversational. Like with Alexa, to keep using that example because it's delightful and obvious, there's no follow-up. There's no going back. Like, you could talk to a person in the kitchen and ask them a question. Like, if you were actually with a human cooking, you ask them a question, and then you could ask them a follow-up question. You could ask, like, do we have any garlic? And they'd say, oh yeah, we've got some. What kind do you need? And then you could ask the follow-up, like, oh, do you have the minced garlic? And would totally follow, or give me the stuff in the jar. You wouldn't even have to explicitly refer to it. But with Alexa just does not remember the last thing you said. So you can't go back and be like, oh, the last thing I told you, do this with it. Or I want to ask a follow-up question to that. And I'm sure they're working on that, but that's really hard. Like, machine learning stuff is really, really hard, and often the hardest way to solve a problem. But if you think of yourself in very system and device dependent way, not from the human perspective, you'll be like, oh, we have to solve this really hard engineering problem. as opposed to being up above it and saying, okay, what are we really trying to solve? And what's the easiest way for us as a company to design something that meets that need? But that might not be very exciting. For example, like websites, extremely not exciting to people now. Menus and buttons, extremely not exciting to people. But it's like solve the problem and then figure out how the technology can help you do a better job of solving the problem by being a more intelligent system that can make better predictions based on past data.
I feel sad when you say like people aren't excited by websites anymore. That just makes me feel bad. But
well, like yeah, like why does that make you feel bad? Do you like websites?
Oh, I just love this. I've been since '93 on the web, designing web. So, but I do like the fact that talking about this, solving problems and having that. And so I was going through the book, and I just want to say like I thought like I said, I was like, I thought it was conversational UIs. And then I read the book. I was like, no, this is I felt like a content strategy book to me as I was going through it. And it's like it was really reinforcing how like words are important and making sure, and then how we get words, to be important and fixating it and trying to build the right vocabulary for our users and to solve the problems that they want to solve that are also like beneficial to us. Like I love the example of Google, like, which is like, Google really wants to get you to where you want to go because they want to sell ads against what you're looking for, and so that's a really good thing. So, and also I was like going through the book, I felt like also I kept on thinking about MailChimp's or Aaron Walters. He wrote about the design personas. Design personas work well in tandem with making conversational designs.
You mean like the persona of the system or the persona of the user?
Personas of the brand, I think, is also
yeah.
So MailChimp has a very certain way. At least they do. Not like I think they still do. But in terms of how they communicate with the customer and make them feel loved when they make mistakes, and so they're very intentional about that. And also in the same way, like Slack, is how they communicate with you. And I think also, like you mentioned. And Flickr as well, like when photo sharing site, they would have like a nice personality about that, and so it's like just infusing personality with that, and so which I think is a great way to go. I think people love it. I was just like I don't know really how you go about instilling that into an office, and so I'm going to ask you a question, which is not a very fair question. So, but it's a question that always pops up. Because we did a conference and we did conferences and we talked to like different, disciplines within web development and design. And so it didn't really matter which industry or discipline it was, but we always got this question. It was like, how do I convince my boss to instill or put this process into place? And so that's my unfair question to you. So there.
Oh, no, actually, that's a totally fair question because, unlike a lot of people, I'm still in the consulting business. And so that's basically what I do is go around and convince people's bosses of things. And so that's a lot more core to my job. And I'd say the way to do it is to really start by being clear about the goal. Because I think that's where these things all go off the rails, right? Like with having a personality, not having a personality, designing for particular devices and not others, taking a certain interaction approach. You all have to start with a really, really clear goal. And I'd say that's the place you start. You start whenever you want to convince somebody of something, and this is really across the board, you start by asking them questions. Like this starts from like Dale Carnegie, right? Every interaction designer should get a copy of How to Make Friends and Influence People, because that's where you have to start is like, oh, I'm trying to convince somebody to do something. And that's true of an interface. An interface is trying to convince you to do something. And that's true when you're working with your colleagues or your boss and trying to convince them to do something. The first way is to listen to them and to understand what they want, what their goals are, and then fit what you're trying to do into their goal. So you should start and say, really, what's our goal here? And be really clear about that. And it's shocking. Like I go into a lot of organizations now, and And I say, okay, you can't collaborate, you can't do research, you can't do design until you have a clear shared goal. And even that can be this huge conversation because it's like, well, what is our goal? I've talked to research departments where they were just given studies to do without a goal. It's like, well, why am I getting this information? It's like, oh, it's just a study we thought of for you to do. And so you have to start there. And once you have your goal, and MailChimp's a great example because MailChimp understood their audience. Like MailChimp understood that when they started their business, email newsletters and email marketing and direct mail marketing was like the most hated segment of everything. Like in advertising and marketing, that was the lowest tier, right? It was like, oh, you wanted to do splashy display ads or commercials or something quote unquote creative. And that's where they were going in. And they were saying, this is really powerful if you do it right. And now we see that's totally true. Like email marketing is still incredibly powerful relative to all of the display crap and other stuff we see. It's so powerful. But they knew that they had to come in and they couldn't just be corporate because that's how people already thought of it as like soulless corporate garbage, spam. And they came in and they're like, hey, we're friendly and approachable and warm and human and delightful. And that was, delight is sort of can be a controversial term in design now. But that was one place where they actually had to make it delightful because the market they were working in had all these attributes of being a soulless grind of things that nobody wanted. And they also knew that because their customer was talking to their customers. So they had to model that, right? They had to say, you have to have, like, if you're going to be in somebody's inbox, you have to give them something they want to receive. So they had to talk to their customers like they wanted their customers to talk to the people they were email marketing. And because a lot of their work was around best practices, like don't spam people, don't make them sad, like with getting all this garbage, like add something to their life. And I think that's a case where having that personality to that business was very important. So if you start with your goal and you start with your context, then you can say, okay, how much about having a quote unquote personality is important and that personality should come from your role in that person's life, right? Because sometimes people confuse having a conversational tone with having a particular set of characteristics. But you can be conversational and have that mode of communicating that's very human and very immediate. And you can be very serious, right? Because if you have a conversation with your lawyer, that's going to be different from having a conversation with the person who's delivering your pizza. I hope you can have a conversation with your banker. You can have a conversation with a funeral director. And those are going to be conversational, but I would hope that they have a different tone. And that's exactly the same when you're thinking about a system. You're like, what do I want people to feel about interacting with a system? And you look at like Amazon, for example, and Amazon is very neutral. Like they have a good use of language and they're pretty conversational, but they're very neutral because they're talking to everybody about purchasing potentially anything from a piece of medical equipment to a book, to a riding lawnmower, to a pair of shoes, to a phone case with their face on it. Like, so Amazon has to understand that they're in the role of like running a giant department store and they can't be super particular in their tone. And it's the same thing. It's just all about the context and how much you want to interact with people and how big of a role certain emotions play in the interaction. And that's really going to guide your approach and whether you have a personality or a character or a mascot. Because the way we're going right now is like every system that uses machine learning is going to have a face and a personality and a name. And you can't remember that. Like the thing I'm talking about now, like Bank of America is launching Erika, their banking assistant. I don't want that. Everybody just wants to talk to like, what's the bank? I'll talk to the bank. That's a normal interaction.
Oh, there's one thing you said just a second ago. I'm not sure how much about it, but you said like delightful as a design term is kind of controversial now.
Mhm.
Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, and this is something I was just talking. I was talking to people on Twitter about it because designers really like to use that term. It's one of these like things crop up in the industry, and the words pop up that come into currency for trying to figure out how to articulate the value that design provides. And delight is a word that a lot of people use. And I'm not saying like don't delight people, but I'm saying that sometimes that's not, there's a layer. What's a good way to put this? Like when you talk about delighting somebody, that implies that the person you're delighting is aware of your existence to a certain extent to have an emotional reaction and to have a specific type of emotional reaction. And sometimes the most delightful thing is to get through the transaction very quickly. And I think that can be unsatisfying to a designer who's in this mindset of, how do I delight this person? And it's like, maybe you delight them by running in the background and they never know you exist. Right. And so, but if you're like, wait a second, I need to add something to this person's experience, like people forget, designers forget that, like, if you look around somebody's context, and this is why it's really good to see people in their environment, you'll see that they're interacting with like possibly 3 different devices. They're surrounded by their material environment. And it's like, why is the one thing you're designing going to like be the thing that they're really paying enough attention to be delighted? And so the reason I think that term is fraught is because it's not taking into account the whole context. And it's sort of saying what I'm designing needs to assert itself in a particular way. And if that's not the case, if you're not designing something that really should have that sort of focus and that emotion to it, then maybe you just need to be super invisible. And I think that can be unsatisfying for designers to be like, okay, they're currently being delighted by, whatever's going on around them. And what you're doing should be invisible.
Okay, yeah, I definitely see like that. That could be like a catch-all. Like people use it as a term for like, yeah, we need to be delightful, and
Yeah.
there's a context for when that's appropriate.
Exactly. And like, what do you actually mean by that? And a lot of times it can be a self-serving term. And that's what I would caution, is make sure that when you say, oh, our role as designers is to make an interaction more delightful, that you're really thinking like that's what the user wants. That's not what you want to provide, right? Don't be the person who's like tapping somebody on the shoulder, like, pay attention to me, pay attention to me. You really have to think about the full context. And that again, going back to being conversational, that's a hugely important part of a system that's conversational or not, is a system that demonstrates context awareness. Because being in a conversation implies a sense of a shared context, and a sort of live feedback loop. And you don't even necessarily need a lot of sensors or, a lot of machine learning to do that. Like even the most basic website can demonstrate context awareness by understanding like the time of day, the geography, the person's previous interactions with the system. Like there's so much that you can draw from the context to make something more valuable. And that's not to say personalizing, because I think personalizing things gets really overvalued in interaction design and system design. It's like being aware of somebody's context is so much more important than trying to target things specifically to people, because you really run the risk of making overbroad assumptions about what they need at that time and not paying enough attention to the current context.
Right. Yeah. I think I forgot the name of his book, but Eric Meyer has a book about about that, in terms of making sure that you have the right context. And that's so true. Like, because I think it's also like, I guess I kind of refer to it as metadata. Like, if you, when you mention like, hey, I'll come to the website in the middle of the night, I'm not really looking forward, to my bank to be delightful. I'm just like, I really want to get this done and get it out there. Maybe the bank's not great job, but great thing. But like sometimes I just, if I'm coming in the middle of the night and I'm not usually there, they can check the history of my log and I log in or whatever. Like maybe they don't really care to know about my auto loan, rate at this time of night. Yeah. They just want to check their balance and move on with their life. So, but yeah. So, and then that's something that I liked about when mobile design came, was like we actually thought about, if someone's on their phone, there's things that they want in their context of their phone, rather than if they're like on the couch with their desktop or their widescreen tablet or something like that. So, but
yeah, it's always, you just always have to really center the human in your design, and this is just like more of that. And sometimes it takes like overcoming. It always takes overcoming the ego to really think, what does the person really need? But if you're really clear on your goal, right, and that's how that helps. If you're clear on the goal, then you're not saying, oh, I'm designing something that's personally satisfying to me. I'm designing something that meets this business goal by really meeting a human need out in the world. And so that's, if you think about it like that, then it makes it a lot easier to work together as a team and make these really complicated decisions about how you're designing the system.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I liked about design, like when I started getting into design and more, because I felt like it's more of a, calling in a way. It's like, I want to serve, and I want to find out the best ways, with the tools I have, with visual, words, the context, and doing that. So, so that's why I feel like, and there's definitely egos involved sometimes. Like, hey, we need to we rush into that and we have problems with that. So, you say you consult, and so how do you work with teams to, I guess, create or discuss design systems into their, products and services?
Yeah. Well, right now we're really kind of shifting. We've done a lot, with Mule, a lot of hands-on design, like actually doing the design work ourselves. And now we're moving, because we've been doing it so long, to working with internal teams to help them, because so many organizations have grown like these huge internal teams. But they still need this external perspective. And so we do that in a couple of ways. Like sometimes we go in and we have like workshops work really well, as long as they're designed in a certain way to support really changing habits over time. And so a lot of it is going in and working with teams to kind of shift their perspective, because it's so easy to get so down in the weeds, even with a group of really, really smart people in a really successful organization. You just get in this mode of like delivery. And then people from the outside can come in and be like, okay, let's go up a level. Let's go to a higher level and look at why you're doing what you're doing and how you're doing it. And give them a different kind of conceptual framework for looking at it, whether it's being more evidence-based, because that's a lot of what we do, is talk about evidence-based design. What a lot of people talk about is research, but I've stopped liking splitting it out like that. Or going in and saying like, okay, let's, we do a workshop on conversational design now. That's like, okay, let's really look at how you're designing things. And are you starting from the meaning, or are you starting from an artifact, right? And kind of shifting how people think about the work from, oh, I'm going to start sketching and then fill in the empty boxes with meaning later. And that's even still the typical content strategy process. But saying, wow, you can start from just modeling interactions just by talking to people on your team. And that's where you should start, and then kind of transcribe and revise that. So we have ways of going in and working with teams to kind of shift their perspective and give them a different set of tools for the process, or a different way to continually ask questions, so that they kind of have that not as like some sort of an external perspective by taking a higher perspective, and don't just get reactive, because that's the problem. You get really reactive to internal pressure, and that's something that like people from the outside, from agencies, can offer, is going in there and saying, we're not going to react. We're going to stop and really be more strategic and more intentional, because that's the whole point of design, is applying an intentional process to solve a problem. But people in-house can get really, really reactive to like, oh, like this executive wants this, or, oh, we got this customer feedback in and we're just going to react to the customer feedback without really thinking about what it means in terms of our overall business, et cetera.
Yeah, kind of researching this, and like you consult with companies. And so one of the things you mentioned is like that the teams, they come in there, even like consult with them and say, hey, I like the fact that you can come in there and say, hey, we need to stop and focus and be more evidence research about that, which I totally love that concept. Instead of just doing research I feel like sometimes people will use research for their confirmation biases.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why people still run focus groups. Like, John Maeda released his report at, as he does at South by Southwest this year. And he talked about how few organizations he looked at use qualitative research. And when they do, the vast majority of it is focus groups. And that's pure confirmation bias. Like you hear people say things, you pick out some choice quotes. Like I have a friend who does market research, and she said so much of the things she gets hired to do are really doing exactly that. Like the CEO needs to make an annual statement. He wants some choice quotes from customers. It's not about really learning, because research is painful because you want to go into it with the mindset of, I want to be proven wrong as quickly as possible. And that can be a huge mindset shift. And also, like the thing that we talk about in our, like especially in our workshops, is the research process has to be integrated with the design process, and it has to be collaborative, because so many organizations that even have a commitment to research have a whole group of, like they might have a whole team of PhDs that they keep in a separate building. So all those people are learning things, but then the people making product decisions are in another building, and every once in a while they get a report that they can then ignore, because that's how it works. And so the tough part about introducing data and evidence and research into your design process isn't doing the activities, like you've got to be a certain amount rigorous, blah, blah, blah. But it's about making sure that you're asking the right questions and you're taking an honest approach that, we want to learn. We don't just want to be proven right. And that's the hugest mind shift to thinking, I always need to be asking questions. It's not like a thing we do at the beginning of the project. It's a thing that we do continuously, the same way that we continuously iteratively design or continuously iteratively code. We continuously iteratively learn. And we learn together so that everybody solving the problem has the same information. And shockingly, this is still a different approach that we can go in. I mean, I'm happy to the extent that it's like, I will never run out of work working with people on this. But at the same time, it would be great if people internally could stop. And I tell people literally to stop work. If you find yourself working and you don't know what the goal is, or you don't feel like your team is working towards the same goal, do not do any more work. Like, make that a really hard line, because otherwise you're just doing stuff. And you can see so many things out in the world are the product of people who just kept making stuff, or who didn't have a clear idea about how to make good decisions. Because that's a huge other part of our work is clarifying the decision-making process, because plenty of stuff started off as good design, but then went through this terrible, poorly designed decision-making process with a lot of bad input from the various stakeholders. And then what came out the other end was no longer good design. And I'm not saying that's the fault of the people making the choices. I'm saying that is a shared, flawed process that needs to be improved through having a better way to give feedback and clarify the goals and all those things.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about how you have the researchers in one building or one silo, and the designers in another site, another department, and they don't talk. And so, I guess it kind of reminds me of, I hate to go back to my history, but of design conferences that we used to run. And they'd be, at one point we did a 2-day conference, one track, and literally, and they were extended sessions, or they're kind of mini, extended, more probably hour and a half type of sessions. So, but people would be one track, and people would be in the same room for 2 days, and we send out surveys, and it's what you didn't like and what you didn't like, and people said I just wish I had time to get to know the person, in the conference. I was like, you literally sat next to people in the same room and ate with them for not in the same room, but we took them else. I was like, you could have talked at any point and talked to them. We weren't holding you back, from talking to other people. So, but it's amazing. So at that point we actually became instigators in conversations. we'd have to find ways to like get people to talk to each other.
Yeah.
Even though like they took the time and effort to fly or travel to get to the same room, and they're like, why am I going to talk to this person? And so is that, you know, a big part of the benefit of having you come in and as a consultant to companies?
Yeah. And that's amazing. That's so, it's so funny. That's so common. Like exactly what you described is like the thing that we say is people could work next to one another for a decade and never truly collaborate because they never have that conversation, that like higher order conversation to say, oh, what are we doing here? And how can we best work together? People come in to these pre-existing contexts, these pre-existing cultures. It's the same thing like a conference or an organization. And we've even had this at Mule where because we've always been a pretty small organization where we've hired people in and they look around, they're like, how are things done here? And we're like, no, you come in and you add to it. Like that's why you're here, is so that you can change how we do things. But I feel like people go into a conference environment or they go into an organization they work for, you know, like, oh, I'm working here now. And there's so much fear, right? This is what we've seen like in all of our work over the years going into every kind of organization is there's so much fear of speaking up because people aren't rewarded for asking questions. People are rewarded for appearing to have the right answer, right? And this is why research is so hard for people, not because doing interviews or comparative research or something is really hard. It's because you have to have the confidence to ask questions. And so I think that's an important thing that companies need to do is give people permission to have honest conversations in the same way that like people felt, I guess they didn't have permission even from the conference or from the people they were with to kind of break, they get really passive. And that just happens. People come into these environments, even people who are otherwise like really smart, outgoing people go into this environment and be like, oh, now I'm a participant in somebody else's deal, whether it's their conference or their company. And we can come in and we're like, hi, we aren't part of your deal. We have no fear. We're going to help you get to this place where you have less fear about raising your hand and going like, okay, before we go any further, let's get really clear about what we're trying to do. And do we have the information we need? A lot of people just don't feel empowered to stop and ask those questions. And that's when a lot of people will just tacitly go together and do something that's not meeting the goals or that's not going to be successful because they don't just continuously have conversations with each other. And this is something that like Jeff Gothelf in like his Lean UX would really talk, like that was like the best part of, I think, that practice to take away isn't necessarily that everybody can be super lean, but that having conversations is part of the work and it's a critical part of the work. But so many organizations have compartmentalized that into meetings. Like you talk to each other during meetings and then meetings are this huge area of dysfunction. But that's when we talk to each other, right? As opposed to, oh, everybody should be constantly interrogating the process in a really lightweight way that doesn't derail it to say like, okay, do we all know what we're doing? Do we all know why we're doing it? Do we all know when we're going to be successful? Does anybody have any objections? And have that be sort of a continuous part of the work that you're always talking about this stuff. And you always feel like if you see something going wrong, that people welcome you saying that as opposed to, whoa, we're all happy in our confirmation bias. Don't mess it up. Don't point out wrong things. I feel like sometimes there's a culture, especially if it's a really hierarchical culture, where it's like, oh God, don't, the director said something that was really wrong. Don't point it out. And everybody's just has this agreement to like, tacit agreement to not point out when the people in charge are doing stupid things, So yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah, I think they go to the culture is like the big issue because I think you mentioned in another area like Project Aristotle, I believe is what was from Google about that people feel safe to discuss things and actually like be okay and to say that they don't know. I guess they say like they don't know, to be okay to say they don't know what they don't know.
Yeah. And I think that's the best test for a team or a company culture is if you're sitting there with your team, how okay would you feel saying, hey, I don't know about the thing you're talking about, or I don't know this, or I don't think we know something, do you feel like you always have to keep up a front of knowing everything, or do you feel totally comfortable saying, hey, I don't know what we're talking about here, could somebody fill me in, and you wouldn't feel like you'd lose status uh, in your on your team? Yeah, and that's what Google did with this Project Aristotle, which is really, really worth reading about. They did like a 2-year study to see what makes good teams good, because they were looking for a formula. And what they found is that the teams could have different numbers of people. They could all socialize. They could not socialize. They could be more hierarchical. They could be flatter. But so there was no way to just assemble a lot of teams according to these certain metrics. It was, do people have psychological safety? Which is like, can they be their true selves? Can they go to people and say, hey, team members, I'm going through some personal stuff, and I'm just like not going to have a really great productive day. I'm going to do the best I can, and have their team support them as a human being, or to say, I don't know, or to like, admit to their vulnerabilities and have their team really have their back. And those are the most productive teams. But organizations still pit people against each other, and still reward individuals over teams. And people do have really low levels of psychological safety. And that the important message there from what we've seen is there's a huge business cost. If people can't support each other and be honest with each other, then half of everybody's brain that works for a company is going to be solving politics. And at the most, you might get a third of people's brains working on their actual work. And most of their brain is like status anxiety. And what do I say to this person? What do I say to that person? And how do I get somebody to make a decision I need them to make when I can't be totally honest with them, because I would have to talk about how somebody higher up the chain had made bad decisions, and that's a career limiting move, right? If organizations create the conditions for people to really collaborate and be honest and have safety with one another and trust one another and be rewarded as teams, that takes away all this overhead of crap and thinking about the politics, which really is like, a lot of companies are paying people like half their salaries to just negotiate the toxic environment.
Wow. Yeah.
So don't do that.
Yeah. I mean, and yeah, that's just kind of amazing. Yeah. So I can definitely see that, where people have to navigate the politics.
Yeah.
To get to the business.
So that's often the biggest service that we provide, is the fact that we don't have that. We can just come in and we'll get to say stuff that we know people inside the organization have been saying, but they listen to us because it's like, hi, we're Mule, we're from the outside. You should do this. And everybody's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like sometimes we'll just stand next to people. We'll be like, okay, who isn't being listened to? Hire us. We'll come in and we'll just be like, these people who are standing next to us, they are like us. Listen to them, almost that, where it's like, hey, these are the people who are going to do this thing. And everybody's like, oh, Mule said we should listen to you. And it's stupid and ridiculous that organizations need that. But if it helps, to have us come in and say the things that people inside the organization would get fired for saying, like, that's a service we provide.
That's pretty fun. Yeah. And then, but I think it also goes to, making sure the teammates that you work with too, and actually like being that, I guess, I would say conversational instigator, mm-hmm. and taking the time to get your coworkers, because to go back to the early questions, was like, how do I convince my boss or
mm-hmm.
XYZ? It's just like, well, it's one day at a time. You just can't say, hey, here's all this evidence, that I'm right, because that will take them off even more.
Yeah, you'll just get shut down. You'll get shut down. And in fact, like one of the exercises I do when I do one of the workshops I do the most often is about this collaborative research and evidence gathering, and is to have people interview each other, just like talk to each other about their lives. And this is like the most amazing part of the workshop, because a lot of times there'll be people even on the same team or on different parts of the product organization or just different parts of the organization as a whole. And I'll be like, just ask each other about your day to day. And just by doing that, just by taking like 5 or 10 minutes, literally, to just say to somebody like, oh, tell me about your work, tell me about what you do. All of a sudden, not only do they know so much more about that person, so it's like, oh, I know that this is your priority. Here, let me explain how my recommendation helps you with your priority. Like, it's not just that. It's also like, wow, I like this person. Like, because you just get to know them, and people will literally either meet each other for the first time in this workshop or overcome all these assumptions they had about their role. It's like, oh, I know that, like, I'm an engineer and you're a designer, and I always had certain assumptions about your job, but I never thought to ask. Nobody ever thinks to just ask somebody about their job. It seems too obvious. But even just taking, like, sitting down, like, with your colleagues and having coffee and just being like, hey, just talk to me about your day to day, and I'm not going to interrupt you with my stuff. I just want to learn about your stuff. If you can do that in a casual way, like, your working relationship will be like 10 times better. And all of a sudden you'll just be able to take so much less time to kind of establish your protocol to talk to them. So, like, that part of being conversational in the work is really important, to just talk to each other about what's going on, like, as individuals, so that you're not making assumptions, because everybody makes assumptions about their colleagues, especially if you feel stressed. You're like, oh, this person's not giving me what I need. They don't know what you need, because they're all up in their own heads with their own jobs.
Right. And I think we're kind of talking about, and just want to kind of, put things in a bow if I can, but is like, how would you know, like, we talk about problems that companies have with culture and communicating, and the idea to, ultimate goal is to help serve the customers, and then by way of serving the company. How do you know what are some signs when you know, like, your company or your culture or your organization is successfully communicating or clicking, just in general?
Yeah, I'd say if people are free to ask questions, and there's no penalty, if people are rewarded for asking questions, if people are rewarded for saying when they don't know something, it's like having a sense that you can be really honest with one another about the work. If you can criticize the work and accept criticism and not have it be really personal, if you know how to have functional disagreements. Dan Brown wrote a really great book, Designing Together, about collaboration. And one of the biggest mistakes people make about collaboration is thinking that you're collaborative if everybody agrees. And that's not true. You're collaborative if people can have really passionate arguments about the work and have a strong point of view, but not take it personally. And so I'd say those are some of the big signs. And also, like, if people are just generally laughing and joking with each other, and you get a sense, like, we can walk into a client's office and immediately get a sense for, like, oh, this is a functional collaborative team, or this isn't, just by how easy they are with each other. Are they joking? Do you get the sense that everybody's supporting each other? And that people aren't waiting. Like, we've also walked into organizations where it felt like people were just waiting for somebody to appear vulnerable so they could go in like showgirls, and just, like, throw beads under their feet and trip them. And so to a certain extent, it is a really qualitative thing. Like, you just go in and you develop a sense for it. But there are these tests about, like, do people generally joke in a good-natured way? Are people, like, kind and considerate of each other? Do people feel like there's, like, a need to really front and be like, no, I'm going to be working till 10 at night and I'm going to work harder. And if you're not here as many hours as I am, then clearly you're shirking. Like, there's a real tenor to the discussion that happens. But I think it's good that people are having more discussions now about what makes culture functional, and breaking down the sort of, like, horrible hard skills, soft skills dichotomy to come to something new, to realize, like, oh, we're designing software for humans to use and for these interactive systems. And we have to interact functionally as people designing and developing those systems, because what we design is going to be a total reflection and manifestation of how we interact with each other.
So the book is called Conversational Design, from a Book Apart.
Yes.
How can people find you online and hire you and save their company culture and communicate better? Save company culture.
So I'm a Mule Girl on Twitter. That's really the best. That's the place I am still to this day. probably to the detriment of my peace of mind sometimes, but I enjoy it. I talk to good people there. And then muledesign.com is our site. And then we publish a lot of stuff on Medium as well. So yeah, those are the places. Cool. And it's Mule Design on Twitter too. We're also on LinkedIn. It's funny, a lot of people seem to have moved towards LinkedIn because that's like the least toxic social network where you can just go and talk about work stuff. So I have all these colleagues and friends who've moved from Facebook and Twitter, and they're like, I just hang out on LinkedIn now because it's safe. So we're there too.
Thank you so much. And
yeah.
And I hope to talk to you soon.
Yeah. Thank you.